Every few days, the news reminds us that center-state relations are rarely calm. There are press conferences, sharp letters, withheld funds, angry resolutions. It sounds like a permanent argument playing out in public, unfinished and unresolved. These tensions feel noisy because they touch daily life. Trains, exams, police powers, language, money, disasters. What looks like administrative friction often hides deeper questions about authority, dignity, and who gets to decide for whom. Federalism, in theory, appears tidy. Boxes, lists, jurisdictions. But in lived reality, it feels like conversation, sometimes polite, often strained, occasionally hostile. It is not something we simply inherit. It is something we keep negotiating. Every chief minister's complaint, every central directive, every courtroom pause tells us that power here is not frozen. It shifts with politics, personalities, crises, and public mood. Federalism breathes, argues, and adapts in real time. This is why it rarely feels settled. The balance keeps changing as new governments arrive, new priorities emerge, and new emergencies interrupt old understandings. What once felt fair can quickly feel intrusive or insufficient or ignored. In practice, federalism becomes a relationship rather than a structure. A relationship shaped by trust and suspicion, cooperation and competition. It survives not because it is perfectly designed, but because it is constantly tested. Tonight, we explore federalism not as a finished blueprint, but as an ongoing negotiation, one that unfolds quietly in files and loudly on television, one that reveals how India actually governs itself every single day. At its core, federalism begins as an idea before it becomes a map. An idea that power should not sit in one place, and that governing a diverse society requires more than a single, commanding voice. It imagines authority as something shared, not divided neatly, but held together. Different levels relying on each other to function, to implement decisions, to give meaning to policies that otherwise remain distant and abstract. In this sense, no level truly stands alone. The center depends on states to make governance real. States depend on the center for resources, coordination, and legitimacy beyond their borders. Each constrains and enables the other. This mutual dependence creates friction, but also stability. Conflict does not automatically signal failure. Sometimes it signals engagement, negotiation, and the refusal of one side to be reduced to silence or compliance. One thinker once described federalism as self-rule and shared rule together. That phrase captures the tension at its heart. Autonomy without isolation. Unity without uniformity. Balance achieved not once, but repeatedly. Because societies change, federalism must adjust. New demands arise, old assumptions fade, and fresh inequalities surface. What worked in one decade may feel inadequate in another, requiring recalibration rather than rigid defense. So federalism lives in the space between cooperation and contestation. It survives through dialogue, compromise, and sometimes discomfort. Less a structure set in stone, more a habit of negotiating power, again and again. When India chose federalism, it did so under pressure. The memory of partition was raw. Violence, displacement, and distrust shaped every decision. Unity felt fragile, almost provisional, demanding constant reassurance. There was also the puzzle of princely states. Hundreds of territories with different histories, loyalties, and power structures had to be woven into a single political fabric without tearing it apart. Integration was as emotional as it was administrative. At the same time, diversity was unavoidable. Languages, regions, cultures, economies. None could be flattened without resistance. Governing India meant accepting difference as permanent, not temporary, and designing power to move across that difference. In the Constituent Assembly debates, this tension surfaced repeatedly. Members spoke of fears of fragmentation, but also of over-centralization. The room carried both anxiety and ambition, a desire to hold together without suffocating parts. That is why the phrase "union of states" mattered. It signaled togetherness but not erasure. A union formed by coming together, not by dissolving identities into a single administrative center. Federalism here was not chosen because it was elegant. It was chosen because it was necessary, a compromise between the need for authority and the reality of plurality, between control and consent. India's federalism was thus born cautious, pragmatic, and slightly uneasy. It trusted neither pure decentralization nor absolute central power. Instead, it bet on negotiation as a way of holding the country together. As the constitutional design took shape, it leaned carefully toward strength at the center. Not out of distrust alone, but from a belief that coordination, stability, and national direction required a firm anchoring point. At the same time, states were not reduced to administrative outposts. They were given space to govern daily life, respond to local realities, and shape policy where proximity mattered more than uniformity. Autonomy was real, though carefully framed. This balance appeared in the way powers were arranged. Subjects were grouped, separated, and shared, acknowledging that some decisions travel best upward, while others must remain closer to the ground. Overlap was expected, even accepted. Schedules quietly carried this architecture. They listed responsibilities, finances, boundaries, transitions. They were less about symmetry and more about manageability, accepting that different regions entered the Union with different needs and capacities. Emergency provisions revealed another layer. In moments of breakdown or crisis, the center could step in decisively. These were safety valves designed for exception, but powerful enough to reshape everyday federal relationships when invoked. Then there were special arrangements. Certain states were granted tailored provisions, recognizing history, geography, culture, or vulnerability. Uniformity was never absolute. Differentiation was written in deliberately and visibly. Courts later tried to make sense of this design. One judicial voice famously noted that India is neither purely federal nor purely unitary, but something in between, tilting, adjusting, refusing neat classification. That observation captures the intent well. The Constitution does not freeze power, it choreographs it. It allows movement, intervention, retreat, and rebalancing, depending on circumstance rather than ideology alone. Indian federalism, then, was built asymmetrical by choice. Strong where unity felt threatened, flexible where diversity demanded respect. A design that anticipated tension and made room for negotiation to manage it. In everyday governance, center-state relations rarely appear dramatic. They unfold quietly through files, phone calls, meetings, and circulars. Administration becomes the daily language through which federalism is practiced, adjusted, and occasionally strained. Policing is one such space. Law and order feels local, but its echoes travel upward. Coordination across borders, intelligence sharing, and response to unrest require constant conversation, not rigid separation. Authority overlaps because reality does. Legislation too reflects this negotiation. National laws often rely on states for enforcement. State laws sometimes seek alignment with broader policy goals. What passes on paper only acquires meaning through cooperation on the ground. Policy implementation reveals federalism most clearly. Welfare schemes, infrastructure projects, and social programs depend on shared effort. Credit and blame are rarely owned by one level alone, creating a subtle push and pull beneath announcements. Institutions exist to hold these conversations. The Interstate Council was imagined as a space for dialogue rather than dispute, a reminder that disagreement need not immediately become confrontation. Its value lies as much in listening as in deciding. The governor's role sits at another intersection. Positioned between center and state, the office carries constitutional symbolism and everyday sensitivity. Much depends not on power, but on restraint, judgment, and an understanding of local political rhythms. Central agencies, too, operate within this negotiated space. Their presence often reflects concerns that stretch beyond one state, yet their effectiveness depends on cooperation, trust, and clarity of purpose, rather than assertion alone. None of this is mechanical. Relationships evolve with governments, personalities, and public expectations. What feels cooperative in one phase may feel tense in another, without necessarily altering the underlying framework. In this daily choreography of governance, federalism is not abstract. It is lived through coordination and compromise, patience and persistence. Less about winning authority, more about keeping the system moving, imperfectly, but together. Fiscal federalism is where negotiation becomes unavoidable. Money carries expectations, priorities, and power. Who collects, who shares, and who decides spending shapes center state relations more quietly, but more persistently than most speeches. Tax sharing reflects this delicate balance. Revenues flow upward before moving back downward, transformed through formulas, principles, and political judgment. What returns never feels purely technical. It feels earned, withheld, adequate, or insufficient, depending on perspective. Finance commissions sit at this crossroads. Periodic, advisory, and deeply consequential, they translate ideas of fairness into recommendations. Their reports spark debates not just about numbers, but about trust, equity, and the meaning of autonomy. Grants add another layer. Some correct imbalance, others incentivize behavior, and a few respond to urgency. Each carries intention. Each also invites negotiation as states weigh flexibility against dependence and discretion against predictability. The arrival of GST reshaped this terrain. It promised cooperation and simplification, but also required states to cede certain freedoms. Coordination replaced competition, even as conversations around compensation and voice continued to surface. Over time, fiscal stress has become a shared concern. States shoulder expanding responsibilities, while resources feel constrained. This gap fuels discussions on borrowing, discretion, and the long-term sustainability of shared financial arrangements. Committees, reports, and meetings repeatedly return to the same question: how much autonomy is enough, and how much coordination is necessary? There are no final answers, only periodic recalibrations shaped by context and consent. What emerges is neither pure independence nor total control. Fiscal federalism survives through bargaining, adjustment, and mutual accommodation, accepting that fairness must be renegotiated as economies change and demands evolve. In this realm, especially, federalism feels less like design and more like dialogue, a continuous conversation about responsibility, capacity, and shared purpose, unfolding quietly behind budgets, briefings, and balance sheets. In moments of federal tension, the judiciary often enters quietly, not as a political actor, but as an interpreter. Its task is not to govern, but to read meaning into contested authority. Constitutional interpretation becomes the bridge. Words written for one moment must guide another. Courts are asked to decide how far power may stretch and where it must stop without freezing governance into rigidity. Disputes between center and states frequently arrive as legal questions. Yet, beneath the petitions lie anxieties about control, trust, and autonomy. The courtroom becomes a space where political disagreement seeks constitutional language. Over the years, judges have nudged the balance back and forth, sometimes affirming national interest, sometimes protecting state space, rarely offering absolutes, more often emphasizing context and consequence. Landmark federalism judgments did not redraw the map overnight. They clarified principles, set boundaries, and signaled restraint. Their impact unfolded slowly, shaping behavior as much as doctrine. One judicial voice once reminded that power must be exercised with constitutional self-restraint. That idea echoes across federal disputes, urging caution not just from governments, but from courts themselves. This restraint matters. An overactive judiciary risks becoming an alternative center of authority. An absent one leaves imbalance unchecked. Federal stability depends on careful calibration, not constant intervention. Through interpretation, the judiciary also keeps negotiation alive. By refusing rigid answers, it leaves room for dialogue between political actors, allowing federalism to adapt rather than fracture under pressure. In this way, courts act less as referees and more as custodians of balance. They remind all sides that federalism is not about winning disputes, but about preserving a relationship. The judicial role, then, is subtle but significant. It sustains the space where disagreement can exist without collapse, ensuring that negotiation remains possible, even when politics grows loud. In moments of federal tension, the judiciary often enters quietly, not as a political actor, but as an interpreter. Its task is not to govern, but to read meaning into contested authority. Constitutional interpretation becomes the bridge. Words written for one moment must guide another. Courts are asked to decide how far power may stretch and where it must stop without freezing governance into rigidity. Disputes between center and states frequently arrive as legal questions. Yet beneath the petitions lie anxieties about control, trust, and autonomy. The courtroom becomes a space where political disagreement seeks constitutional language. Over the years, judges have nudged the balance back and forth, sometimes affirming national interests, sometimes protecting state space, rarely offering absolutes, more often emphasizing context and consequence. Landmark federalism judgments did not redraw the map overnight. They clarified principles, set boundaries, and signaled restraint. Their impact unfolded slowly, shaping behavior as much as doctrine. One judicial voice once reminded that power must be exercised with constitutional self-restraint. That idea echoes across federal disputes, urging caution not just from governments, but from courts themselves. This restraint matters. An overactive judiciary risks becoming an alternative center of authority. An absent one leaves imbalance unchecked. Federal stability depends on careful calibration, not constant intervention. Through interpretation, the judiciary also keeps negotiation alive. By refusing rigid answers, it leaves room for dialogue between political actors, allowing federalism to adapt rather than fracture under pressure. In this way, courts act less as referees and more as custodians of balance. They remind all sides that federalism is not about winning disputes, but about preserving a relationship. The judicial role, then, is subtle but significant. It sustains the space where disagreement can exist without collapse, ensuring that negotiation remains possible even when politics grows loud. In recent months, federal tensions have returned to headlines with familiar regularity. Disagreements over laws, funds, and authority surface as urgent stories, often framed as crises. Even when they reflect longer-running conversations, states have questioned centrally framed legislation, not always rejecting intent, but seeking space in interpretation and implementation. What appears as defiance is often a demand to be heard within a shared governing arrangement. Financial disputes have also grown sharper. Delays, conditions, and competing priorities turn routine fiscal coordination into public negotiation. These moments expose how deeply governance depends on trust, not just transfers. Administrative control has become another flashpoint. From appointments to compliance, states sometimes read central actions as overreach, while the center views uniformity as necessary. Both claims coexist within the same constitutional space. Investigative agencies, too, draw attention. Their movement across jurisdictions raises questions of accountability and intent, even as their mandate remains national. The friction here lies less in legality, more in perception and timing. These episodes travel quickly through media cycles. Sound bites replace nuance, and disagreement is read as breakdown. Yet most disputes continue within institutional channels, through courts, councils, committees, and correspondence. What we are witnessing is not collapse, but stress. Federal systems strain when politics intensifies, resources tighten, and public expectations rise. Negotiation becomes louder, more visible, and occasionally uncomfortable. Importantly, these tensions are not new. They recur because federalism distributes power without alienating contest. Each generation replays the same questions under different circumstances and pressures. Seeing these moments as symptoms rather than failures changes perspective. Conflict does not always signal defiance. Sometimes it signals engagement, an insistence that shared power must remain genuinely shared. Contemporary flashpoints, then, remind us of federalism's nature. It is not a quiet arrangement. It is a living relationship, periodically strained, repeatedly renegotiated, and sustained through continuous imperfect conversation. Over time, new phrases entered the conversation. Cooperative, competitive, even coercive federalism. These terms did not rewrite the Constitution. They tried to capture changing behavior, moods, and power dynamics within the same basic framework. They emerged in policy reports, speeches, and governance discourse, often as shorthand, a way to describe how governments were relating at a given moment, rather than how the system was permanently designed to function. Cooperation, when it appears, is rarely abstract. It shows up in shared programs, negotiated targets, and flexible implementation. It depends less on rules and more on willingness, trust, and political alignment. Competition enters when states compare performance, attract investment, or showcase delivery. This rivalry can energize governance, but it also reveals uneven capacities and the pressure to measure success in visible outcomes. Then, there is the language of coercion, which surfaces during moments of strain. It reflects perceptions of pressure rather than formal change, signaling that negotiation has started to feel one-sided or hurried. What matters is that these labels shift over time. The same arrangement may feel cooperative in one phase and coercive in another, depending on context, leadership, and the wider political climate. Policy documents often adopt these phrases to frame intent. They guide tone, signal expectations, and shape narratives, even when the underlying institutional tools remain unchanged. Seen this way, federalism absorbs these ideas without being replaced by them. The Constitution stays put. Behavior evolves. Language follows practice, not the other way around. These terms help us read the moment, not define the system. They remind us that federalism is experienced through interaction, not through static categories fixed once and for all. As this conversation winds down, federalism returns to its quiet rhythm, not as a design to admire, but as a practice to live with. It survives through talking, listening, adjusting, and occasionally stepping back. Indian federalism works not because it avoids conflict, but because it makes space for it. Disagreement becomes a signal that power is shared, not settled beyond question or reach. Every file moved, every meeting held, every compromise reached adds to this daily democratic practice. Federalism is renewed not in moments of consensus, but in the willingness to keep negotiating. Restraint becomes its unsung virtue. The choice to not push too far, to wait, to allow another voice to matter. This patience often goes unnoticed, yet it holds the system together. There will always be moments when the balance feels off, when authority feels heavy or autonomy feels thin. These moments do not end federalism. They test its capacity to adapt. Seen this way, federalism is less about structure and more about habit. A habit of sharing power without pretending it is easy or ever finally resolved. Perhaps that is its strength. Not perfection, but endurance. Not clarity, but continuity. A system willing to remain unfinished because the country it governs is always becoming. And so, the conversation continues. In offices, courtrooms, assemblies, and homes. Quietly, imperfectly, day after day.